before, how Bernie killed Rosa Luxemburg. Okay, let me explain. First, I'm going to talk about the role of social democratic parties. In the last video, I talked about the German Revolution, the early formation of the KPD, the German Communist Party. Well, okay, so now, up to 1917, the Russian Revolution was successful. In its wake, there was a wave of revolutions throughout Europe and Germany. German Revolution, which I described. There was a revolution in Hungary. A Soviet government took power in Hungary for a couple of months. It collapsed eventually. There was a Finnish, very bitter, bloody Finnish civil war. It was horrible, between the Reds and the Whites. In Finland, the Whites won, the counter-revolutionaries won, unlike Russia. These were little known but important elements in history. In Italy, right after the First World War, there was a workers' uprising for 2 years, especially in northern Italy, Milan, a period called Biennio Rosso, the 2 red years, where workers took control of factories and fought off the police. Period from 1919 to 1920. Communist groups were involved in that. There were offshoots or factions within the socialist parties of Italy. Communist groups were involved, but they weren't well organized to give the working class leadership in that situation, so it failed. There was also, in the wake of World War I and influenced by the Russian Revolution, there was an uprising in Glasgow, Scotland, not well known as Glasgow Soviet. There's a Limerick Soviet. Workers' councils briefly took control of parts of the cities in both those places, little known today. Also, I believe last video in my last video I mentioned the Seattle mass strike of 1919, where workers, the working class, actually took over the city of Seattle for a time. The movement collapsed because there was after I believe about a week, because there was no way forward, no group providing a program or direction forward. And also during that period, there was a counterattacks in the U.S., what they called the Red Summer of 1919. There were a wave of racist attacks against black communities all over the U.S. One of the most famous ones was the Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma, where mobs of white racists destroyed it, basically drove people out, killed dozens of people. It was actually bombed from the air by the Air National Guard at the time. It's pretty horrible. And okay, anyway, throughout this period, in the immediate aftermath of the First World War and the Russian Revolution, it was widely believed that Europe was lurching into a period of civil war and class war. So to this radical revolutionary socialist at the time, this posed the problem of revolutionary leadership. We have to give good leadership to the provide some leadership or some way ahead for the working class. Workers' parties, First World War had exposed them as thoroughly reformist social democrats who weren't going anywhere, who were preserving capitalism, basically. So, in the wake of the Russian Revolution, there were splits in the socialist parties of Europe and in the U.S., and the Comintern, Communist International, was organized. Some of the Bolshevik leaders, cooperating with the Germans, some of the German communist leaders. Rosa Luxemburg originally thought the Comintern was premature. She was not happy about it being founded when it was, but nevertheless, Lenin had hoped for a successful German revolution in which Berlin would be the center of the Comintern, the Communist International. And even the original official language of the Comintern was German, not Russian. But of course the German Revolution failed, as I mentioned in my earlier video, and Comintern became dominated by the Soviet Union, who gave advice and funding and things like that. And anyway, there were splits throughout Europe. The Italian Party, of course, mentioned Germany, the German SPD, the Italian Socialist Party, other countries. There were splits, left-wing splits, and they formed communist groups. And there were conditions to affiliate with the Comintern, the Communist International. They were known as the 21 conditions, and the most important of these, parties wishing to join the Comintern had to remove reformists and centrists. There were no people like Kautsky or Bernstein, like reformist or revisionist, would not be tolerated. It wasn't like the USPD, the Independent Socialists. No, the new parties would have to be solidly revolutionary parties. And also these parties had to oppose both social patriotism, which was support, like socialist support for World War I, like we're defending German workers against Tsarist Russia, we're defending French workers against German militarism, and so on. No, that's your enemy is the ruling class, simple as that. Also both social pacifism, which a little different but kind of related. Well, we just don't want war. We want war. We want a workers' war. It's not all nations can't just get together. No, there are profound drives of capitalism to force countries into war, and it's necessary to have an understanding of this. So that was what was going on, and there was also in the 21 conditions the Comintern had for affiliation were stipulations for propaganda work in the army of their countries, in the trade unions, among peasants and farmers, who were a sizable part of the population in those countries. And there were also parties had to have preparations for going underground, for underground work. It was believed Europe would soon be lurching into a prolonged civil war situation. And the Comintern was supposed to be like an officer corps, leadership, elements of leadership. In the U.S., the IWW, International Workers of the World, was invited to join the Comintern. They negotiated for a while, but eventually decided not to affiliate. And in the U.S., there was the famous Socialist Party of Eugene Debs, who was, after a huge amount of debate, was anti-war. Debs himself and other leaders were arrested for making anti-war speeches. But the party, the Socialist Party itself, moved to the right with state support. Several leftist groups split from the U.S. Socialist Party and eventually coalesced into two rival communist parties. For about 9 months, the Comintern demanded that they unite, and about 9 months they did in 1919. And Eugene Debs originally was very sympathetic to the early Communist Party, and I think the communists had hoped that he might join them, but eventually he didn't. He eventually moved away from them. And during that period from 1919, 1920, 21 or so, it was initially a very repressive time in the U.S. Socialist communists were jailed. Socialist state legislatures were just illegally kicked out of their position. Socialists were arrested. There were sharp restrictions on freedom of speech. Ironically, there was after a war, the U.S. supposedly fought for democracy, to make the world safe for democracy by destroying democracy. World War I was an unpopular war in the U.S., and the U.S. government pioneered the use of mass propaganda. There was a Creel Commission and manipulation and control of the media to try to elicit, like manufacture of consent to elicit support for the war. Early 1920s, it became evident that the revolutionary wave in Europe and elsewhere was ebbing, and capitalism had stabilized itself. Leon Trotsky was the first to recognize this, and he convinced the other leaders of the Comintern, the other Bolshevik leaders. However, it's important to keep in mind that capitalist stabilization in the early 1920s was temporary. Capitalism is always prone to crises. It can't overcome its tendency towards crisis, and the revolutionary wave of the early 1920s ebbed, but a few years later, there was another huge crisis, the 1929 Wall Street crash, and then the Great Depression hit Europe a few years later by the early 1930s. So the Comintern, anyway, put a lot of importance into organizing and agitating the colonial world and the semi-colonial world, countries like India and China. China was a semi-colony, I guess. India was a colony. South America, semi-colonial, African countries, and elsewhere. Comintern put a lot of emphasis into communist organizing in these places, especially after the revolutionary wave ebbed. And in early 1920, there was in 1920 is the Baku Conference, the Congress of Peoples of the East. It was a meeting of Third World revolutionaries, because India especially was a huge part of the British Empire at the time. If there was an uprising in India, it would have had major effects in Britain and in Europe at the time. So this was considered a key part. The exploited Third World would be a key part to revolution elsewhere. Anyway, during the interwar years, from the 1920s to the 1930s, European countries had communist and social democratic parties. There were mass communist parties in Germany, France, and Italy, smaller communist parties in Britain and other countries. Now, I don't want to go into a whole history of the Comintern here. Just the early history is very important. By the mid-1920s or a bit earlier, after Lenin died, the Comintern started going off the rails. They gave in to political opportunism, and they sacrificed revolutionary movements for the stability of the Soviet Union, or more precisely, the Soviet leadership, or elements of the Soviet leadership. Some examples of this were in China. There was a communist party, small but growing communist movement. The Comintern pretty much forced them to work with and almost really merge with a party called the Kuomintang, the Chinese Nationalist Party, which was a bourgeois party essentially, and they were merged into it. And anyway, under Chiang Kai-shek, the Kuomintang, the Nationalist Army, began conquering the warlords and so unifying China somewhat. And in 1927 in Shanghai, they turned on the communists and massacred them. This was an utter disaster, which the Comintern led, and that stage of the Chinese Revolution was destroyed. It was in 1927. There's a book by Harold Isaacs called The Tragedy of the Chinese Revolution, which describes this. Similar things happened elsewhere. Spain, the Comintern played, I think, a horrible role, more supported the conservative elements in the Spanish Republic. Really played a bad role, and there were disastrous results. And the same true is also in Britain in 1927. There was or Britain earlier, there was a general strike, and the Comintern played a really negative role, and that could have played a better role. C.L.R. James, who's originally a Trotskyist, later on he moved towards a different type of politics, but he wrote classic work. It's called The World Revolution, 1917 to 1936. He described the history of the Comintern as a degeneration from originally a revolutionary organization to coordinate revolutionary struggles around the world. It thoroughly degenerated by the 1930s. So, in the interwar years, Europe had communist parties and also mass social democratic or labor parties, as I mentioned. These labor parties or social democratic parties, as I mentioned, were pro-capitalist worker parties, essentially. They sometimes in Germany and elsewhere attracted older, more conservative workers, or that was the party workers had known before the war. They focused on bread and butter issues. These parties used socialist slogans. As capitalism had stabilized, they helped stabilize the capitalist system overall. However, as I said, they used socialist slogans in the wake of the Russian Revolution. The British Labour Party had the famous Clause 4, and I'll read it. This was in the wake and influenced by the Bolshevik Revolution. Clause 4 states that to secure for the workers by hand or by brain the full fruits of their industry and the most equitable distribution thereof that may be possible upon the basis of the common ownership of the means of production, distribution, and exchange, and the best obtainable system of popular administration and control of each industry or service, which is essentially the economy run by the working class. It's socialism. And it was adopted in 1918 in the wake of the Russian Revolution. It was very popular. It was interpreted then as now as meaning workers' control of the economy, as socialism, reorganizing the economy under worker control and ownership. Of course, the leadership of the Labour Party never meant this. A kind of interesting event in the mid-1950s, there was a guy named Hugh Gaitskell, who was a Labour Party leader and theoretician. He actually dropped Clause 4 from the Constitution of the Labour Party, and there was he was a huge backlash against this, to show, and they voted to put it, workers or members of the Labour Party voted to put it back, not only to put Clause 4 back, but to put it on the membership cards. So it was a way of saying, up yours to you, Gaitskell. That was how powerful the sentiment was. Well, it was finally, Clause 4 was finally scrapped, I believe in 1995 under Tony Blair. There's been talk of bringing it back, or a modified form of it with Corbyn as leader of the Labour Party. I don't really know what's going to happen, but So, as I said, the British Labour Party was a workers' party, but essentially pro-capitalist. They sabotaged many opportunities to build workers' party, workers' power of working class. The working class take over. There was the general strike of 1926, which lasted 9 days, and of course, it was a very heated time in Britain. According to some interpretations, this could have escalated into a revolutionary struggle for workers' power. And Lenin and other Bolshevik leaders wrote about it, but the union leadership and the party leadership of the Labour Party worked to diffuse the situation and demobilize people. It's complicated, but really important history. And there was a big flop for the workers' movement at the time, and there have been other examples like this. So, the Labour Party did have power in Britain, did take power, was the ruling party in Britain at times, but they didn't fundamentally change the system. They kept the monarchy, the House of Lords, and things like that. They didn't fundamentally change things. They put some industries under state control, which to some extent was good. To some extent, these were the commanding heights, but they were of the economy, but yesterday's commanding heights, like propping up dying industries and so on. Anyway, interesting story. They didn't fundamentally change the capitalist mode of production. So you can see the Labour Party and other social democratic parties were essentially pro-capitalist workers' parties. There were some gains for the workers, but their basic role was to stabilize and preserve capitalism. And Lenin specifically wrote this about the Labour Party, did a really interesting analysis of it. So, in the very early post-World War I period, there are debates about, within the Comintern, debates about how communists should relate to social democrats. They were, in some countries, social democrats, that's where the workers were. So how do communists relate to social democrats? Should you completely oppose them? Should you try to appeal to their members, etc.? And they're very complicated debates. In some ways situational. The answer would depend on from country to country. Generally, the idea was to criticize the leadership of social democratic parties, have no connection with them, split, form separate organizations, but be open to their working with their workers, the rank and file workers. And of course, I mentioned Trotsky's and others' idea of the United Front. So, in the interwar years, the 1920s, 1930s, social democratic parties in Europe were ideologically amorphous and confused. Shortly after World War I, there were various attempts to recreate a socialist international, other than the Comintern. There was what they call the Centrist International Labour Party, like a party or people who try to be revolutionary, have one foot in the revolutionary camp, another foot in the more moderate reformist camp. They were kind of caught in between. They were essentially centrist, politically centrist. There's International Labour Party, which was a kind of a leftist faction of the British Labour movement. They sort of sympathized with the Russian Revolution, but sort of didn't. Trotsky sarcastically called this the 2.5 International. Those attempts largely flopped. In July 1920 in Geneva was the last Congress of the Second International, were finally following its functional collapse in the Second World War. So the very early social democrats after World War I were influenced by what we call the Austrians. That is a group of Marxist theorists from Austria, including Rudolf Hilferding, Victor Adler, Otto Bauer, and other the famous Marxist theoreticians. They actually had crushed a communist uprising in Austria themselves. They had a theory, like before World War I, of autonomy, since they were working in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which was a multinational, multilinguistic empire. So they had a theory of socialism, like autonomy for local nationalities. And there's some interesting ideas, but they moved away from the idea of international worker solidarity and eventually became essentially reformists. They dropped any idea of revolution or internationalism. And they had a lot of influence in the very early post-war period. So European socialists generally wanted gradual reforms, maybe wait for a socialist revolution eventually. And there's also a move from the idea of revolution altogether. The Belgian socialists had a really interesting post-war, interwar Belgian socialist, a really interesting case. There's a guy named Hendrik de Man, really fascinating figure. He was a long-time Second International activist, very theorist, very influential guy. He fought in the First World War. He was a social patriot. He was a leader of the Belgian Workers' Party, and he developed a theory of state planning and intervention within a capitalist framework, sort of we call planism, or the plan to man. And there's an interesting Jacobin article about him. As a political movement, this idea of planism became very popular in the 1930s among social democrats in Europe, not only among Belgian workers, but also among what they called neo-socialists across Europe, especially a movement in France. The French neo-socialists argued that the rise of fascism showed the urgent need to introduce state-planned capitalism as opposed to the traditional strategies of gradual reformism or waiting for the revolution to come. And later I'll talk about the horrible role of French social democrats. Anyway, Hendrik de Man had by this time lost faith in the possibility of workers' self-emancipation and their own economic self-management. As I said, he volunteered to fight in World War I. Now, he was horrified by the Russian Revolution. It says, while for many Marxists, the Russian Revolution of 1917 confirmed the agency of the working class, this world-shaking event indeed sowed apprehension and frustration in de Man's mind. Together with the Belgian socialist leaders, Emil Vandergelder. Emil Vandergelder was a very famous Second International leader of the Second International. He was a pro-war social democrat. And around 1917, after the February Revolution, he went to Russia and talked with the radical socialists there, the Bolsheviks and other groups, and tried to convince them to be pro-war, to stay with the war effort. And they said no. They listened to him politely, but said nope. So Vandergelder and de Man went to Petrograd, tried to convince them to stay in the war, said nope. No way. Later on, de Man went to the United States in April of 19 as a member of a government delegation to study what's called Taylorism. Taylorism was a famous managerial philosophy which entailed breaking down work in factories or production work into break it down and de-skill it as much as possible and break it down to small pieces where you could measure work per time. It's horribly dehumanizing, was widely hated by workers where it was introduced. It's still around today in different forms. There are different versions of it still around today. But anyway, this Taylorism made a huge influence on de Man, and de Man overall moved towards type of managerial, elitist planning. He believed in eugenics. His philosophy didn't trust the lower classes, and he felt that they needed an intellectual elite. Now, Lenin was erroneously stereotyped as believing this, and I think it's erroneous, but this is much more true in the case of de Man and other social democratic leaders. And as leader of the Belgian socialist movement and of Belgium, he was the prime minister of Belgium for a time, he welcomed the Nazi invasion and he willingly collaborated with them. He felt, de Man said about the Nazis, said, far from being a catastrophe, this collapse of a decayed world represents liberation for the working classes and for socialism. He's referring to the Nazi invasion. So he ran Belgium for a time under the Nazis, willingly collaborated with them. A bit later there he had a falling out with the Nazis, who he wanted to keep some Belgian independence. He was kind of marginalized. They sort of treated him okay, but kind of marginalized him. And he went to Switzerland during the war, which was neutral. Hendrik de Man stayed in Belgium, stayed in Switzerland after the Second World War. He couldn't leave. He was wanted for treason back in Belgium, and he was killed in a car accident in 1952, which some people think was suicide. He has a tragic legacy. There's been, interestingly, the last couple of years, a revival and interest in him. I'm not really sure why. But the Jacobin article discusses the idea of this collaboration and authoritarian sympathies, where the consequence of his rejection of Marxism after the First World War, and there was a theoretical shift that might have been stimulated by his authoritarian personality and generalized this for the whole of Europe. So there were Marxist Revisionism of the 1920s and 1930s, a wave of reformism led to basically a whole generation of socialists to move towards variations of fascism, ranging from Mussolini, who was originally in the left wing of the Italian Socialist Party, to Marcel Diat in France, Oswald Mosley in Britain, and so on. So there were some socialist leaders who ended up as fascists, moved away from revolutionary politics, and ended up as fascist collaborators. Not all of them were like this by any means. Most social democrats honorably resisted the Nazis. You could debate how effective this were. The majority of them were not collaborators, but a sizable element was. In the case of Denmark, it's really interesting. It had a social democratic government while it was occupied by the Nazis. And the Social Democrats went out of their way to get along with the Nazis. They provided they were not revolutionary by any means, but they worked to provide some space for a variety of reasons. The Nazis pretty much gave them autonomy. The Danes were able to protect their Jewish population to their great credit. It's debatable how effective this was, but it did provide them some space. They didn't resist the Nazis, but they did get some space and were able to protect themselves from some of the worst of what the Nazis were doing. Interestingly, in Germany, before Hitler took over, as I mentioned, there were there's a mass socialist party, the SPD, as well as the KPD, Communist Party. Mentioned Karl Kautsky, the famous theoretician who became largely a centrist. Towards the very end of his life, like the 1920s, late 1920s, he kind of moved to a theory that if a today we call neoliberalism, that if a socialist took power in a capitalist society, capitalist state, they'd have to manage it as capitalist managers. If a socialist runs a capitalist country, you'll have to be the best capitalist you can be. So it means avoid reforms which could inhibit the workings of capitalism and so on. It's kind of an odd formulation, but it had some influence. The last social democratic chancellor of Germany before the Nazis took over was Hermann Müller from 1928 to 1930. And partly under the influence of late Kautsky, they kind of held back for more reforms in social welfare benefits. This was in the wake when the Great Depression hit Germany and Europe. So the Social Democrats held back from greater social reforms and then greater social welfare than they might have. This was right before the Nazis took over, and possibly a minor contribution to it as well, one of many bad moves Kautsky made. So Hitler took over Germany almost without firing a shot. There actually were some street battles in Hamburg and Berlin, but so both there were huge socialist and communist movements. Like, what happened? Basically, the KPD and SPD had, of course, a bit of rivalry. The SPD would have crushed the German Revolution, were the murderers of Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, so understandably a lot of really bad blood. Understandably. Also, there was the Comintern. That period had the idea that the Social Democrats were social fascists. It was what they call the third period of the Comintern, type of ultra-leftism. Social Democrats, as opposed to aligning with them, this time they were the same or just as bad as the fascists. And so Trotsky and others had a theory of a united front. That is, yeah, the Social Democrats are horrible, but you want to appeal to their members, to the workers. Not their leadership. You could call out and critique their leadership, but you can work with their workers, with their members, rank and file members, and you can try to expose the hypocrisy of their leadership, like offer an alliance with their leaders. If they back away from it, well, we know what they're like. And Trotsky at times basically begged both the KPD, the German Communist Party, and the Social Democrats to try to work together or form some alliance, at least from below, at the lowest level. He made a famous speech in Copenhagen, Denmark. Trotsky made a famous speech in Copenhagen to social democratic students. He said, look, I'm not a social democrat. We have major disagreements. I'm a communist. We have major differences, but you need to work. Social democratic workers need to work with the communists in resisting fascism. Need to try, and anyway, unfortunately, it failed. Later on in France, It was what they call a Popular Front, initially led by a guy named Leon Blum, socialist president of France. He was a prototype of what's called the Popular Front, which is a coalition of socialists with liberal parties. There's a pressure to form broad anti-fascist people's coalition. And really interesting article by Dan Labatz, who's a socialist theoretician. I have some disagreements with him, but this is a really good article. His article is entitled "The Popular Front, A Social and Political Tragedy, the Case of France." Came out in the journal New Politics. And from this article, it said, well, so often workers, when a Popular Front government takes power, it happened in France, in Chile under Salvador Allende, in many other places. Initially, the workers think it's their government. So you can see in Chile and in France, there was a wave of strikes. And this is the late 1930s, the worker occupations of factories, and there possibly was a pre-revolutionary situation. So the Popular Front government largely diffused and diverted this. So the Communist Party, the French Communist Party, was not part of the Popular Front government. So France was a very, very polarized society in the 1930s. The Great Depression hit. There was mass unemployment in France like everywhere else. There was a rise of fascism. There was a Nazi government in 1933. Nazis took over Germany. There was a very militant workers' movement in France, but there was also a powerful right wing. There were times France almost on the brink of civil war. So I believe it was there was a civil war going on in Spain nearby as well. So in 1937, a Popular Front government took power. I believe it was 1937, led by Leon Blum, coalition of socialist and some liberal parties to oppose the fascists and oppose the right wing. The Communist Party didn't join it mainly for public relations' sake. They didn't want to alienate the liberals, but they strongly supported it from outside. And so during this period, the French workers thought, it's our government, we've taken power finally. But the communists refrained from calling for the nationalization, which French Communist Party, which is huge and very powerful, refrained from calling for the nationalization of industries and workplaces under workers' control as a step towards creation of a socialized economy. They refrained from really working towards the workers' takeover. Mainly because the Soviet Union didn't want to alienate the British and the French and the French ruling class and the British and other countries. They were worried about Nazi Germany, and they were working towards some sort of alliance. So they wanted to keep everyone happy. So Dan Labatz in his article goes on to say, to have raised demands such as factory committees or workers' councils, which threaten property and capital supremacy in the workplace, or to have demand strict and effective controls on prices and profits, which would regulate or transform the market, would have placed the communists at odds with the radicals and the haute bourgeoisie. There's the other parties, the socialists were allied with in this Popular Front government. They were jeopardizing the French alliance with the Soviet Union. So Stalin subordinated everything to the survival of his regime in the Soviet Union, including the French working class. So at the time in France, in the 1930s, the Communist Party was the only party with the authority and organization to have led the working class to expand its power in French society, and its failure to do so would lead to government and employer reaction that would crush the workers' movement. So the Communist failure to follow up on the strikes and factory occupations. There was actually a huge strike wave and massive factory occupations in France. Communist failure to build on this, building workers' power in the workplace, meant that it opened the door wide open to an employer's offensive, an initiative from the right. So the failure to advance the power of the working class meant that the power of the capitalist advanced. So in politics, you have to keep moving ahead or you get pushed back. The best defense is good offense. So in reaction to the strike, which had resulted in union recognition contracts as well as social legislation, and in a kind of de facto workers' control over various aspects of the workplace, the employers organized and fought back. So by the late 1930s, There was a new right wing, a kind of anti-popular front developed. It was made up of the old political right, new middle-class conservatives, and employers associations, who are now. This would now be the right wing that would really pretty much welcome the Nazi invasion and form the political basis for the Vichy collaborationist government during the Second World War of France. So you is a horrible role of Social Democrats, and this has been replicated. What happened in France in the 1930s has been replicated many other times. So while the Popular Front in France remained in power, it gradually lost ground in society and politics because it failed to take the initiative in the workplace. So, dates here, the first Popular Front government of Leon Blum lasted only from June of 1936 to June of 1937, to be succeeded by the more moderate socialist governor Camille Chouton. Blum served as prime minister for a month again in the spring of 1938, but at that point the Popular Front lasted less than 2 years and disintegrated. After the Popular Front collapsed, Edouard Daladier of the right wing of the Radical Party, so-called Radical Party, served as prime minister from April of 1938 to March of 1940, and he provided political support for the employers' offensive. This was the right had gotten back in power. And despite social legislation that had been passed, the employers pushed workers to work more than 40 hours a week and gave up on the 2-day weekend. There are government decrees which reduced social services and increasingly took on increasing taxes on consumption wages. Price controls were ended, and there was a strike wave, and the Daladier government, the conservative government response to the strike was brutal, which was the worst of the interwar period. The government at one point arrested more than 500 militants and others sentenced some to a few days in jail, others got years in jail. So this shows how the Communist Party's Popular Front policies of support for the capitalist government had disoriented and disarmed the labor movement and resulted in a catastrophic defeat. With the Popular Front and the unions defeated and the right wing in power, there really remained no effective opposition to fascism in France. And in May of 1940, Hitler lost an invasion of the Low Countries and of France, and by June 25th, the French government finally signed an armistice. The Germans conquered them almost without a shot, or there was some fighting, but easily conquered France, called them surrender monkeys, but that's why the elements which were capable of resisting fascism were destroyed or sabotaged from within by social democratic collaborationist policies. So the German army occupied part of France, while the rest of the country was controlled by the collaborationist Vichy government. In France, civil liberties and political democracy disappeared, the left was suppressed, and the labor movement was subjugated. Wages and working conditions declined in France, while many French workers were sent to labor in Nazi Germany. By November 1943, over 1.3 million French workers had been sent to Hitler's Germany to work in factories there. The Popular Front had failed in France disastrously. I should mention that the Popular Front in France, as well as the French Communist Party, were pro-imperialist. They didn't really fight for France getting out of its colonies, which was in Algeria, Indochina, Syria, Middle East, and elsewhere. French Empire was huge, and the leftists didn't want to get rid of the empire or have solidarity with anti-imperialist groups within the empire. Later on, another example of bad Popular Front tactics was in May of 1968. There was a strike wave in France, briefly a strike wave. 10 million workers were on strike, many of them occupying their workplaces. Charles de Gaulle, who was president of France, was scared. He actually flew to NATO headquarters in Germany, and the idea that maybe come back to France, restore capitalism with a NATO army. Anyway, there was a series. Workers were literally occupying the factories. It was just a small step towards actually revolutionary seizure of power. Workers taking over the factories and running it themselves. This movement was diffused by the socialist and communist parties of France. They diverted into parliamentarianism, electoralism. They or advised the workers to go back to work. And the movement died. There were some wage increases, and French society was opened up and liberalized to some extent. But the contest for seizure of power, which was posed, just totally collapsed. So you see the post-war trajectory of social democratic policies, post-World War II trajectory of social democratic parties in Europe went back and forth, but the dominant move was towards managing capitalism in a social way. So in the post-war period, also the CIA, post-World War II period, during the Cold War, most of Europe was a member of NATO, anti-communist alliance facing the Soviet Union, a U.S.-dominated alliance. As evidence in Scandinavia, the CIA was heavily involved in social democratic parties, partly to prevent them from going further to the left. Finland, they actually were heavily involved in the Finnish SPD. They sponsored them. It's on Wikipedia, really. Finnish SDP, Finnish Social Democratic Party, article in Wikipedia. It is because of the SDP's anti-communist activities, the United States Central Intelligence Agency supported the party by means of funds laundered through Nordic sister parties or through organizations that brought, quote, luxury goods such as coffee abroad, then imported and sold them for high profit, as post-war rationing served to inflate prices. The CIA was involved in European social democratic parties after World War II. In the German SPD, something called the Bad Godesberg program, ratified in November of 1959. Basically, it abandoned socialism, the socialist transformation of society, as a goal for the SPD. It moved them away from Marxism. The Godesberg program represented a fundamental change in the orientation goals of the SPD. It rejected the goal of replacing capitalism, adopted a commitment to reform capitalism and build what they call a People's Party orientation that appealed more to ethical considerations, and rejected a class-based orientation. That was Edward Bernstein's idea, big time. And the Godesberg program rejected nationalization as a major principle of socialism. The Godesberg program was also notable because the party abandoned and rejected Marxist theories of materialism and class struggle. In adopting the Godesberg program, the SPD dropped its hostility to capitalism, which had long been the core party ideology, and sought to move beyond its old working class base to embrace the full spectrum of potential voters, adopting a political ideology grounded in ethical appeals. Labor unions had abandoned the old demands for nationalization, instead cooperated increasingly with industry, American-style business unionism, and they achieved labor representation in corporate boards, which we don't have here, and increases in wages and benefits. So the SPD, the German SPD, after losing national elections in 1953 and 1957, moved more towards an American-style, image-driven electoral strategy that stressed personalities, especially focused on the then mayor of Berlin, Willy Brandt, famous SPD member. As the SPD prepared for elections in 1861, it became necessary, as well as in 1860, to drop opposition to rearmament and to accept NATO. So the party was fully on board with imperialism, with capitalism, and so on. Now, other parties went back in Europe, went back and forth. The French Socialist Party had some bona fide socialists, although hard to say. In the case of Francois Mitterrand, who was the socialist president of France, really interesting case. He appeared early stage. He or his followers were bona fide socialists and wanted the socialist transformation of society. Mitterrand was the socialist prisoner of France from 1981 to 1995, a really long time. The first 2 years, he appeared to be a leftist, although kind of more of a left Keynesianism. He looks like he tried to take over the banks and had plans for the nationalization of industry. This was opposed by the ruling classes. There's something like a bankers' strike and major economic dislocation. They sabotaged, ruling classes sabotaged his program. Mitterrand quickly backed down, and the rest of the time, his period as president and leader of France, he was a neoliberal. He essentially began austerity like Reagan, Helmut Kohl, Thatcher were doing. He was part of that nexus. Like, he was useless. He was a time server, basically, had no vision. He ran as he was a socialist president of France, but essentially neoliberal, pro-capitalist. And I think if Bernie Sanders ever becomes president of the U.S., I think it's highly unlikely, but if he does, he'll go the same route. After the first year or two, he'll just be like any other U.S. conventional U.S. president. It'll be even his moderate demands like Medicare for all or free college education or nationalizing nationalizing a few industries, energy and transportation, which are relatively moderate demands, actually. They'll be fiercely, bitterly opposed by both the Democrats and Republicans, and he won't be able to enforce it without to enact any of this without a mass movement, which he's done really nothing to build, pretty much, and he'll be sabotaged. So my guess, after a year or maybe two at the most, he'll be a conventional neoliberal president. He'll disillusion his supporters, and that's when things might get really scary. We might move into like bona fide fascism. People say, well, we tried socialism, it didn't work. We tried to support Bernie, it didn't work, and look how horrible things are now. That's when things start to get interesting and a little scary. Another example was Tsipras, Alexis Tsipras, who is Greek Prime Minister of Greece. He was a leader of Syriza, a Greek leftist party. Its acronym means Coalition of the Radical Left. Syriza came out of what's called the Euro-Communist tradition. It was a movement in European communist parties in Europe and elsewhere, kind of a disillusionment with the Soviet Union after the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968. So they had a theory of national communism moving away from Soviet-oriented communism, but most of them moved towards, basically became reformist. Essentially, they abandoned the idea of internationalism and essentially reformed. They had a theory of working through the state, the state as the main terrain of struggle. So they accepted conventional bourgeois politics and they backed away from revolutionary politics. So the state and parliamentarism is the main focus of struggle, like national communism. So the context through the early mid-2000s, Greece was being hammered by the European Union. The long story, but Greece has been saddled with debts, which the Greek people weren't responsible for. The ruling classes and Goldman Sachs have some responsibility for this. Greece had these debts, which the average Greek worker wasn't responsible for. Then the European Union, what they call the Troika, the European Central Bank, the IMF, etc., really putting enormous pressure on Greece, like squeezing everything they could from them. The standard of living rapidly plummeted. It was and is a humanitarian catastrophe. The European Union was effectively destroying Greece. The reason why we're largely political, not the banks, and it was largely, European Union was largely dominated by German banks. Not that they cared all that much about getting their debt back from Greece, but it was a political reasons that you can't, there's no alternative to austerity, towards neoliberalism, towards what we're doing. So, in 2015, Syriza was elected after waves of mass protests and general strikes in Greece. The Greek working class was heroic and very militant. Waves and waves of super militant strikes and protests were crushed or went nowhere, one after the other. Finally, the movement went into electoralism, and they elected Syriza in 2015, a radical leftist party, which had roots in the Greek Communist Party years ago. They took power, and after, I think, about 6 months, Greece had a referendum. Do you want to leave the European Union? And so they could have had two directions. They could have stayed in the European Union, continued to accept the horrific catastrophe they were facing, leave the European Union, which also would have been very difficult, but it would have opened up some field of resistance. They could have left the European Union, brought back the national currency, the drachma, nationalized and confiscated the Greek oligarchs, who themselves were making a huge amount of money out of the European Union-sponsored austerity. They could have confiscated the oligarchs who were hiding their wealth, and it could basically nationalize the commanding heights of the Greek economy and appealed for solidarity with workers throughout Europe and the rest of the world, and moved away and pointed a direction ahead instead. So they had this referendum, and the majority of people voted yes to leave the European Union. So after like 6 months or so of inaction, like the Cyprus and Syriza are in power in Greece, a radical party, they're not doing anything, like months after months. Okay, finally, about 6 months later, they finally do something, and the majority of people vote to leave the European Union. What happened? 2 days later, nope. Cyprus says, nope, we're going to stay in the European Union, which meant they had to sign these horrifically humiliating agreements with the European Central Bank and what they call the Troika, the institutions, various groups, had to sign ultra humiliating conditions to stay in the European Union, which meant Greece was squeezed even further and living standards continued to plummet. Young people continued to mass immigration out of Greece, and the movement was destroyed. Any movement for resistance was sabotaged. That's what happens when you know, either way it would have been difficult for Greece, but at least they could have had a way out. But no. So that's the situation right now. In the last election, Syriza was rightfully voted out, voted out of power, and the old right wing, whom everyone hated and was really marginalized, the New Democracy Party was brought back, and that was the ruling party of France. So, that's the situation. So leftists become social democrats from different directions. Some start off and always are reformist. Some former communists are pushed back by the demands, by the situation, things like that. So the Syriza party, I'd say, were later day social democrats. The original heirs of the Second International are social democrats. Some former communists became social democrats. People become this way from different directions. So as I said, this is generally popular fronts. Social democrat techniques have had horrible results. Another example is Chile under Allende. Salvador Allende was elected as a socialist president of Chile, and he started to make some reforms. And his chief of staff was Pinochet, Augusto Pinochet, who stabbed him in the back. Same with Morales. I believe his military chief of staff was also with one of the leaders of the coup, etc. Happens almost every time. So it's saying he who makes a revolution halfway becomes his own gravedigger. Now, in the U.S. situation, there's a group called, there's a social democratic movement. The main center of this is a group called the Shachtmanites, followers of Max Shachtman. He was a early leader of the U.S. Trotskyist movement. He broke from Trotskyism basically in 1939, 1940 over debates. Trotsky and the mainstream of the movement believed in uncritical military defense of the Soviet Union, while Max Shachtman and the group around him moved away from this, and maybe they're both bad. Soviet Union they're not socialist, they're not even like semi-socialist, a deformed worker state. We don't know what they are, but they're maybe qualitatively just as bad as capitalism. So anyway, the debates went on. Trotsky and others predicted that Max Shachtman himself would move further to the right, and it was 100% correct. By 1970, Max Shachtman, originally a Trotskyist leader, he supported Nixon, he supported the Vietnam War, while claiming to still be an orthodox Marxist. So the trajectory was Max Shachtman split from the Socialist Workers' Party. He had a group, the Workers' Party. There's a group within that which moved further to the right. They joined or rejoined the Socialist Party, which was run by Norman Thomas. Max Shachtman had to sign an affidavit saying he was no longer a Trotskyist, but he rejoined the Socialist Party group around him. They had a kind of conservative influence on it. The Socialist Party moved, it was part of a rump at this point, but they moved even further to the right. At that time, they did, Norman Thomas and others, and Shachtman had ties with the CIA. Norman Thomas contributed and funded organizations which were closely connected to the CIA. They bought into the Cold War idea that, capitalism is bad, but so-called communism, Soviet communism, is just as bad or even worse, and that's the real enemy. And you read some of Shachtman's later stuff, it's kind of bizarre. Also, Shachtman and the group of people around him had what's called a realignment strategy. They believed in entering the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party could be moved towards the left. Different interpretations of the realignment strategy, but the most famous version of it is a guy named came from a guy named Michael Harrington, famous socialist writer or social democratic writer. He was originally a follower of Norman Tubbs, follower of Max Shachtman. He kind of split off at one point. Shachtman joined the Socialist Party by 1970 or late 60s at the start of the 1968 Chicago Convention, Democratic Party Convention, which turned into a police riot. Police began beating demonstrators. So the Socialist Party had people in the convention as Democratic Party delegates. They had people on the streets who were protesting, being beaten up by the cops, while some of the leadership was on TV watching it, who supported the cops and voted for Nixon. So the party broke up. Socialist Party split into 3 or 4 factions, but later, I think by 1970, I forget exactly which. So anyway, Michael Harrington was originally a follower of Max Shachtman. He kind of split off at one point, didn't go quite as far right wing. Michael Harrington had his own idea of the realignment strategy, the basic idea that this white Southern racist would leave the Democratic Party, so the Democratic Party would be northern and have more minorities in big cities, and that basically happened. And he thought the Democratic Party, the rump of it, the remainder, would move to the left in the social democratic or socialist direction. That did not happen. The South did leave the Democratic Party, but the rest of the party moved to the right, the far right instead. So, interesting stories. The realignment strategy did not work, but there are big echoes of the strategy. The DSA came out of this. Michael Harrington formed, I believe, in the late 1980s, what became known as the DSA, the Democratic Socialist of America. They originally fought for a realignment strategy, which never really worked. Today, the DSA are essentially a faction or part of the Democratic Party. In their bylaws, their constitution, they say, "We do not, however, call for an immediate and total break from voting or supporting any Democratic Party, any Democratic candidate. We all fervently supported," sorry, this is from an article in Jacobin. It says, "We do not call for an immediate and total break from voting for or supporting any Democratic candidates. We all fervently supported Bernie Sanders in the presidential primary and recognize that he probably would have been a footnote to the campaign if he tried to run as an independent. Voting for Democratic candidates in specific state and local races can be justified in many circumstances." I disagree with this. In the same document, the DSA says the DSA's official line is to build social movements while voting for Democrats. So there's an article in the International Group, the socialist organization. I have disagreements with them, but some of their articles are quite good. And it critiques the DSA, because the article says, what the DSA statement is, in the immediate to long term, we'll work to build the organizational capacity necessary to run candidates of our own, but in the short term, we're working with the Democratic Party. And so it says the DSA has been so deeply embedded in the Democratic Party for decades that it doesn't even describe itself as a distinct political party. Consequently, it was hardly a factor at all in left politics. The DSA amounts to nothing more than putting pressure on the Democrats, seeking to nudge them to the left. Its calls never outstepping the boundaries of the capitalist order. And this is true about the right and the left of this reformist pro-capitalist organization. That's basically true. And you read social democratic literature. Like I read Michael Harrington's books years ago, and I went through a Michael Harrington stage. Some of the stuff he wrote in the 1980s says, we need new ideas. We don't have any ideas. He's discussing, I think one of his books, Socialism. He says that we've run out of ideas. He was saying this from a social democratic perspective. We don't have ideas. And you read this in social democratic literature just about anywhere. It kind of says the same thing. Well, we reached a dead end. We don't have any new ideas. We're stuck in this situation. That comes from being embedded in capitalism in the bourgeois state, not building any alternative to electoralism in this bourgeois state that we have now. They've got themselves a period of neoliberalism and neoliberal offensive. Social democrats have got themselves boxed into a corner, and there's no real way ahead for them. So in conclusion, basically, I've talked about in these videos what socialism is. It's workers' control of the means of production. And I've gone over a little bit of the history of the socialist movement and the difference between socialism and social democracy and some of the historical differences. Okay, I hope you like my video. If you do, like and share my videos, and thank you very much.